Have you ever driven into a town where the lights were on, but no one was there? Have you ever heard a forest go completely silent, like it was hiding something? Or been told never to whistle in the woods because something might answer back? Tonight, these are true wilderness stories that will make you think twice before stepping into the dark. Don't forget to subscribe. Enjoy. What scary stories from the woods do you know from Grandpa and Grandma? I'm talking about real stories that get passed down from one generation to the next. I know a few of them. A little about me: my family's from West Virginia, but I was born in Germany because my dad moved there. So I grew up split between Germany and West Virginia, spending time with my grandpa, grandma, and the rest of the family. Kind of like a 50-50 mix. That's why I'm pretty familiar with the Appalachian stories and those from the woods. So, my grandpa always had a certain respect for the darkness. One night, I was trying to bring their old dog, Teddy, inside. It was probably around 7 p.m., just when it was starting to get dark, a normal late summer evening. But he didn't want me going outside then. He would always say, after 6 p.m., we don't leave the house alone, and once it gets dark, we don't leave at all. I used to think he just said that, because there were animals out there or something. Later, I asked him why we couldn't go outside, and my grandma said, "You don't talk about that, or it brings bad luck." Grandpa just said there were folks around here who went out and never came back, but when I asked why, he would change the subject. It wasn't until I got older and started helping with hunting and wood cutting, and the woods became more a part of my everyday life, that he started opening up a little more. He told me the danger wasn't the woods themselves, but the things. He always called them things that watch you and want you to stay. Most of them won't harm you, but they make sure you get lost. Back then, I thought it was hard to believe. Well, mostly hard to believe, and I still do, to some extent. But I figured if an 80-year-old man is saying this stuff, it can't all be made up. A few months later, I asked again, since he always shut me down before, and he said, "Boy, sometimes it's better not to know everything. But you want to know, don't you?" And that's when he started telling me a few stories. He mentioned there was a family in the 20s that had immigrated from Belgium and didn't follow the rules. He said they'd go out at night, unprotected, just by themselves, and some of them didn't come back. He told me a bunch of stories about people who went into the woods and never returned. He also said you should never whistle in the woods. If you do, everything goes quiet. No animal sounds, nothing. When that happens, you got yourself a problem. You'll feel watched, get chills, and you'll start thinking there's something behind every tree. He said when you whistle, you wake up things in the woods that should have stayed asleep, and if they hear it, they'll wait for you. Another rule he had was no music. No playing music or even listening to it while working or hunting. Not cause of the animals or anything, but the forest has its own rules. Break those, and you won't make it back home easy. He said too much artificial noise, whether it's whistling, music, chainsaws, or motors, can invite these things to come after you, and they get mad. They'll stalk you, and the noise just makes them angrier. Another story: there's these old abandoned cabins that people avoid. The cabins are empty, but something waits there. If you walk by, you'll start hearing things. Sometimes a footstep, sometimes a whisper, but you won't see nothing. He said that's when you walk into a trap, because the woods want something from you. I'm not entirely sure what to make of these things. Ironically, he always says Hollywood monsters like Bigfoot are made up nonsense, but his own stories, he stands by them. The reason I believe at least a little, is cause sometimes you'll find footprints in the backyard, especially at our woodcutting site, and these wooden symbols like A and W in the woods. I've only seen them once, and then never again, like Grandpa set them up or something. But I gotta admit, I do have a mix of respect and fear, even if I'm not fully convinced. In Germany, they just laugh at stories like this. What is the scariest thing you have seen in the forest? Avid hiker and nature enjoyer here. I've got a couple stories. A recent one was on a pretty popular and well-kept trail in northern Wisconsin. I visited that trail frequently in my early 20s. It had a couple loops, ranging from just over a mile to a couple reaching nearly 7 or 8 miles. One year, I noticed that someone or some group began to place animal bone effigies along various trails. These bones were cleaned and bleached, like a stark white without any staining. It started with just little bones inserted into rotting trees and stumps. And then I started finding bones tied together with twine into weird symbols, hanging from trees just off trail, usually significantly above eye level. Then I started to find entire deer limbs shoved into hollows of trees or between boulders, still bloody and raw, but strangely avoided by insects. Eventually I started finding heaps of presumably deer meat just laying on a boulder off trail, dusted with forest detritus yet strangely uneaten by animals or bugs. I'm sure it was just someone pulling pranks, or some wannabe witchcraft stuff. It was just odd because I walked that trail several times a week during all hours of the day from nighttime to morning or noon, rain or shine or snow, and never saw anyone hanging or arranging things like that. Another time when I was 17 or so, I was backcountry backpacking in northern Minnesota with 2 friends for a week-long trip. On the second day of our journey, shortly after we began the hike for the day, we passed a guy with a huge black wolf dog, and he stopped and chatted with us briefly. He gave me ex-Marine or law enforcement vibes, but something about him and his dog felt uneasy. The dog kept whining and looking down the trail behind them, and the guy just seemed shifty and eager to get out of there. I noticed he had a pistol holstered at his hip, which didn't bother me at all. But what bothered me is that he seemed so on edge despite the security of a firearm. He told us he noticed a single middle-aged male walking off trail that morning in a dark green raincoat and just got bad vibes from the guy. Surely enough, later that day, the 3 of us noticed a figure in a dark green raincoat quickly step off the trail while we were walking on a long straight stretch, and we happened to glance behind us. For the next 2 days we thought we kept seeing him, only behind us, and thought we kept hearing footsteps in our campground at night. We took bathroom breaks together, never went anywhere alone, and it honestly really ruined the vibes of an already rainy and muddy hike. Every night we fell asleep damp and clutching knives, bear spray and poop shovels like we were about to go out fighting. On the 3rd day of paranoia, we got to a campground filled with college-age girls, all being loud and overexcited and simultaneously scared of the woods. We thought sharing the camp would be good for safety. We warned them about the guy that we had been seeing, and their demeanor changed quite suddenly, and told us they had been hiking for a few days from the opposite direction and had encountered a married couple that warned them of the same guy. We thought it would be safe with them, but that night we woke up to a girl shrieking, and then chaos broke out. Something crashed away into the woods, and a few of the braver people in our camp popped out of their tents with flashlights and headlamps. It turned out someone had tried to open one of the solo tents on the edge of the camp, and the girl inside woke up to a figure crouching half in her tent. She kicked at the figure, striking it, which immediately ran away. Some girls were getting absolutely frantic. I decided to gather some people together to start a bonfire, which was nearly impossible given the wet wood. Luckily, I found a stand of rotten birch trees nearby and managed to harvest some bark for kindling and had some people join me to keep watch until morning. We were supposed to have another 3 days in our hike, but decided to call it a quits after that and called our ride to come pick us up from a different trailhead. I really didn't like hiking much after that, always feeling an overbearing sense of paranoia that someone in the woods was watching me. My last story for this post, I was solo hiking in Michigan when I was around 24. It was an old-growth forest, a really beautiful region. The hike was pretty but rather mundane and uneventful. I got a handgun for self-defense after the hysteria in Minnesota. It was supposed to be just 2 nights through a 12-mile loop of rather steep and hilly terrain. On my first night, 4 miles in, I got to my campground at the bottom of a valley. It was oddly still and quiet, no wind, and extremely cold for the season. There was supposed to be a creek running through the valley, but it had been dry, so I didn't have enough water for a good dinner and ended up snacking and preserved my water for the next day. I just couldn't sleep that night. It had been the first time I was solo backpacking, and I just felt vulnerable. I was maybe 20 meters off trail. It was so still and quiet out. I could hear random animals skittering about, and the incessant whine of insects. I was laying there for what felt like hours when suddenly I realized there was no sound at all, no animals, no insects. It was like the world had been muted. That's when I realized the ground had started to rumble, very gently. I perked up, and it sounded like there was a large group of people marching by, with the familiar drum of boots on densely packed earth of a trail, but dozens upon dozens of pairs of feet, and the talking. It sounded like whispering at first, and then a cafeteria of people talking, distinct voices all saying and conversing, but not a word could be made out. I felt like I was going crazy, but I could even see my water bottle vibrating from the footsteps. It got closer and the voices got louder, but I couldn't make out a word. I checked my phone, and it was 2 a.m. My heart was pounding. What could people be doing out here in the dark? Even through my rain fly, I could see the dim light of the moonlit sky through the trees, but I couldn't see any flashlights or lamps. It sounded like 100 people were passing by. I was shaking so badly and so scared when suddenly it stopped. My heart froze and my throat caught a lump. It felt like I was surrounded with 100 pairs of eyes on me. I chambered around in my pistol and took the safety off and just lay there, not daring to move. And I waited and waited and waited. No animals, no insects, no wind, and I waited. Then something fucking exploded. It felt like my whole world erupted. A shockwave passed through my body and rocked my whole tent. I thought I had let my gun off at first, but all 15 of the rounds were still there. My ears were ringing. It sounded like a jet had passed by. With the sonic boom, there was a roaring sound that quickly traveled away too. I nearly peed myself, and feeling a surge of adrenaline needing to pee really badly, I jumped out of the tent with my 10,000 lumen fuck you flashlight and quickly swept the sparse woods surrounding my tent and quickly dropped my pants and peed right outside my tent with a pistol in one hand and my flashlight in the other. I felt so crazy. I finished up and leapt back into the tent, saw it was 4 a.m. on my phone, cried a little, and hid inside my sleeping bag again. I waited until morning and finished the rest of the 8 miles that day on 0 sleep. I haven't gone solo backpacking since. Scariest true experiences in the woods in nature, not exactly proper backcountry, but there is this place in southeast Alaska called Daya, and it's kind of tucked away in this small bay. It's a tidal flat located near the start of the Chilkoot Trail, so it backs up against these rugged coastal mountains and thick northwestern forest to the north, and there's a ghost town. There is a river on one side and the ocean on the southern side, and these towering mountains all around. The area had once been a hastily built little town to outfit the prospectors going over the pass on foot. But when they built the train into Skagway, the town was torn down and moved a few miles down the coast and reassembled. All that's left is one false front, the dirt roads and a bunch of pits in the ground where the houses used to be. Farther south, out on the tidal flats, a bunch of trees were cut down when the town was thrown up, but have started to regrow over the past 100 years. So there are all these little stands of short and fat Sitka spruce, which are really pointy. The trees don't tower overhead and block the light. You can lose someone really easily, though, if they go ahead through a stand of trees. They're that thick. That also means you can be mere feet away from a bear and not know it. Our naughty husky used a network of fat tree stands to evade us for 30 minutes one time. The farther south you go, the more it thins out into native grasses. North, the trees get thicker and taller. That's where the town is, in the thick older forest. The mountains also come straight down to the ocean to create this closed-in effect. The whole place has kind of a mournful, isolated feeling because you know so many people died horrible deaths going up the Chakut Pass, just above you. I grew up exploring ghost towns up and down the west coast and Colorado with my grandfather because both he and his father had been prospectors, and he loved to go back and visit those places. So Daya was right up my alley. Anyway, the first time I was thoroughly creeped out, we were camping nearby, and I was just walking my dogs through the ghost town one last time before bed. Even before I got out of the car, I felt like something was wrong. I knew the heightened feeling of a bear or predator close by. This was different. This was looming dread. But I had this idiot instinct to translate fear into bravery and do it anyway. So I got out and started walking into the forest, and the feeling got stronger and stronger. The dogs were timid and hesitant. There was strong wind too, which just made it worse. Whatever was giving off this vibe seemed new to the dogs, or they were much more wary of it. I felt followed, watched, stalked, just very unsafe. I got turned around because I was scared and was not paying attention and ended up getting lost. I felt like I was deep in the woods now, and panicked bad, I know. I wanted to get out immediately and had no desire to be brave anymore. Now the feeling was imminent danger. I had goosebumps and I felt sick to my stomach. I decided to just head in a straight line until I hit the river or the marsh, and then I'd just follow that back. I needed to head north to get back to the truck. So I hightailed it in a straight line through the bush and suddenly came out on the tidal flats. I'd gone south in the opposite direction. I was devastated. Now I had to go back through the death woods to get out. But the feeling of dread had subsided a little though, and at least I knew where I was. I knew my way around the flats better. I remembered there was the network of dirt roads on the flats I could use to navigate my way out. I had to carefully thread my way through the thick, pointy spruce to get to the main road. Now I'm worried about bears, but I would trade that for whatever was back in the forest. At least I could see overhead, use the mountains as a reference point to find my way back to the road. I found the road and started heading back. I had no idea what that was back in the trees, but I had zero intentions of ever going back to find out. The road was fine and the dogs relaxed until it entered that thicker, darker forest again. Guess that feeling wasn't confined to the ghost town. Dogs nearly stopped walking and fell behind me. Thank you, dogs. I was so frightened, I just broke into a full-on sprint down the road until I got back to the truck. I remember shaking and I started the engine and spinning gravel to get out of there. It wasn't a predator warning feeling, or that get out feeling people describe before a Sasquatch. It was a straight up, you're gonna die, we're gonna get you feeling. I felt hunted. When I got back to the state campground, my husband was surprised that I'd been gone so long, which is weird because I thought I'd come back early. Anyway, I downplayed the creepy part and just told him I'd gotten turned around. I kind of chalked it up to being late at night. Went back to the tidal flats a few times over the years, but never had that feeling driving through the forest. Until one time, maybe 3 years later, when my husband had gotten into photography and wanted to check out the cemetery, which was a little north of the ghost town. As soon as we turned onto the road, I felt smacked in the chest with that sense of looming dread. It was like the intention to stay in that part of the forest somehow summoned that feeling of malice. It was so strong that I refused to get out of the truck. I wanted out of there so badly I was pushing against the back of the seat. My husband and son felt nothing. They knew I was not happy but tolerating it and didn't stay too long. Returned one last time with a friend who was visiting and had that same feeling, but to a lesser extent. Now I just don't go into the forest when we go to the tidal flats, other than to pass through it on our way to the flats. I don't really have a good explanation for what happened. Years later, a coworker talked about visiting the cemetery with her kids and said her oldest daughter refused to get out of the car and said that place was evil. So I was validated by a 10-year-old girl. It's a long story with no real outcome. Can't explain why I feel like we're all going to die, but the person next to me is having a great time. I have had other creepy experiences in the woods, but that was the only place I felt that acute sense of danger. What is the creepiest thing you've seen in the woods, or in the mountains, or in deserts, or caves, or in small towns, or in remote or rural areas, or while on large bodies of water, or while on an aircraft, or a nautical vessel? A little over 18 years ago, I had just gotten out of the military. I drove all the way from Louisiana to my hometown in Montana without incident. I spent a few days at home and then got back on the road because my new home destination was Boise, Idaho. It was February, so instead of going straight down the length of the state, I cut across the panhandle of Idaho into Washington. The highway going straight down through the state is really twisty and very dangerous in the winter, so I crossed the state line into Washington. It was a Sunday, and it was very, very early in the morning. As cliche as it sounds, there was quite a bit of fog in the air. I had been driving for a while, and I really had to use the bathroom. Now, normally, given how I was out in the middle of nowhere, I would normally just pulled over on the side and took a whiz, but since it was so foggy and hard to see, I thought it safer to just wait until I hit the next small town. So I drove for maybe 5 more miles, and I started seeing signs for a town. I can't remember for the life of me the name of the town, but I think it was Linden or Linda, something like that. It was on I-90 going into the Spokane Valley, so I head towards the sign, which was a right turn off the interstate, and it's a short drive up this road, and I reached the town. It was small, but I thought nothing of it, since I was from a small town in Montana. Now here is where things get odd. There was not a single person to be found. There were cars and business, but not a single person to be found, no one walking the street, no logging trucks driving. Everything was just as still as the air. I stopped at a gas station. It was one of those in all places that did car repair tires, but no one was at the counter. I thought, well, maybe it's just really early. So I went around to the side to see if the bathroom was locked, and it was. As I made my way back around to the front of the building, saw a delivery truck. It was a Coke Classic truck. Except it wasn't moving. Its headlights were on. The hazard lights were on, and the passenger and driver side doors were open, just sitting there in the middle of the street. Yes, I was getting a bad vibe, so I got back in my car and went back the way I came. I got back to I-90 and thought again about just pissing on the side of the road. But honestly, I was too afraid. I continued driving until I hit Spokane. Honestly, I was more than a bit freaked out and had completely forgotten I had to piss. I didn't see anything creepy or hear anything creepy, but the stillness in the air and the complete lack of life, human or animal, was just terrifying and unsettling. I looked on the map to where I was. Once I got to Spokane, which was a Rand McNally's map, but because GPS on phones was just not a thing yet, and I could not find it at all on the map. Even as I was writing this, I looked at Google Maps, and nothing by the name Linden Linda or otherwise is on the map. I still to this day will never forget that feeling of just freaky displacement I felt there. When I got to Boise, I told my friend about it, and he thought I was just trying to rip off Silent Hill or Resident Evil. And honestly, I can't blame people for saying that. But at the same time, that was the reason I wouldn't piss on the side of the road. I kept recalling the part in RE1 where the hikers were killed by the murderous dogs. Anyway, if you stuck around this long, thanks for reading, and if you know of a town on Highway 2 between Coeur d'Alene, Idaho and Spokane, Washington, people let me know. If you are from there, I mean no offense, but your town is creepy as fuck. Edit, I have to correct myself. After going back over my trip, I didn't stay on Highway 2. I actually jumped on I-90 and then went over to Spokane. Last couple of days I have been thinking about this, and I have a 3-day weekend coming up. Maybe I will take a road trip up to northern Idaho and see if I can find this place again. Maybe I'm tempting fate here, but it's gonna be my 37th birthday, so here's to adventure. Scariest thing you have experienced in the woods, scary or creepy? To me, those are two very different things. I'll share both stories with you. Several years ago, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 300 miles. 500 kilometers around the western US solo. At night, I most often preferred to wild camp. Rather than paying to sleep on the ground in a campground, I would just find somewhere to disappear into the woods, somewhere people were unlikely to find me and even less likely to care that I was there. The forest, I quickly learned, makes for far from a quiet night's sleep. After the first few weeks of this lifestyle, I had come to find comfort in the droning of thousands of crickets and toads. It was always a highlight of my night, though not particularly uncommon, to hear the yips and howls of a distant pack of coyotes, and I fondly recall one night when I was lulled to sleep by 2 owls, one on either end of my tent, hooting back and forth. If nothing else, it wouldn't take much of a breeze to stir music from the tree canopies. A bit over a month into the trip, I was way out in the middle of nowhere in western Montana. After a full day of cycling on incredibly sparse roads, I found somewhere to set up camp for the night, went through my usual bedtime routine, pitched the tent, eat dinner, write my final journal entry of the day's events, study maps for the coming days. Living outdoors all day every day, my sleep schedule more or less cinched with the sun, and so I laid down in bed shortly after dusk. That's when I made a disturbing observation. There was not a single cricket chirping nor toad croaking, certainly no owls. There wasn't even the slightest breeze to rustle the dry leaves of early autumn still clinging to the trees. It was truly and completely silent, and that was terrifying. I can only describe it as the loudest silence I've ever felt. It was as if the entire forest was hiding from an equally silent predator. Suddenly, the occasional snapping of a twig, a common sound normally lost in the cacophony, rang out like a gunshot. I slept terribly that night, and I'll never forget the immense relief I felt with the first bird song of the pre-dawn hour. So that was my creepiest night. What about actual fear for my safety and well-being? That came a month or so later on the same trip. I was somewhere in southern Washington state, with my sights set on Portland, Oregon. Again, I was just wild camping in the woods, and I started coming down with food poisoning. I spent the whole night tossing and turning and leaning out the door of the tent to vomit. I'd finally throw up, then use some water from one of my bottles to rinse out my mouth, drink some water to help replenish the fluids I'd lost, then lay back down. Feeling better, I'd get a couple hours sleep before waking up once again feeling nauseous. Come 4 a.m., I dreaded the thought of getting back on the bike. I simply didn't have the energy for it. But what other option did I have? Just wait alone in the woods and pray I recover quickly. Besides, I'd used up all my water through the night. I had no choice but to get on the road. Looking at my maps, there was a town not too far away with a motel where I could put myself up for a night of proper rest. It would be 30 miles or 50 kilometers. A reasonable half day for me, under ideal conditions. Right as the sun came up, it started raining, so I waited out the brief 20-minute storm in the tent. Rain stopped. I took down the tent, loaded up the bike, and hiked it back to the road. Get on, start pedaling, and something feels weird. It's a flat tire. Just my luck, right? But I had the tools, spare parts, and knowledge to fix it, so I get to work. In my less than ideal mental state, it took far longer to fix than it had any right to, and by the time it was back together and holding air, it had started raining again. No option other than to turn on my lights, put on my jacket, and just ride through it. The words overwhelming hopelessness don't feel big enough, but I don't know how else to summarize that day. I was cold and wet. I was hungry, but didn't want to put too much into my still upset stomach. I was dehydrated. Remember, I'd used up all my water the previous night, and I was tired in every sense of the word, sleep deprived, physically aching, mentally exhausted. Every rotation of the pedals felt like a feat of Herculean strength, but somehow I continued to find that strength. I made it to the motel, took a long hot shower, called my mom, slept for 13 hours straight. Long story slightly shorter, I woke up the next morning feeling surprisingly good, and managed to outrun the food poisoning for a day or two to Portland. Eventually it caught up to me while I was out at a museum, but one rest day on the toilet of the hostel got it all out of my system for good. In hindsight, I'm just thankful the shits waited until I was back in civilization. The flat tire and the rain, that was just demoralizing. But that night before, that was without a doubt the most scared I have ever been for my own safety while camping. I honestly had no idea how I was going to get myself out of that one. That's it for tonight's stories. Subscribe if you dare to hear more. And remember, sometimes the woods don't want you to leave.